Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Carnegie for an especially, I'd say, welcome program for me. Andrew Wood and Lilia Shevtsova have just produced a new book, which I think is quite an extraordinary piece of work. It is creative both in format, because it's a conversation, and as you can tell from the book, it's a rather long conversation. But it is also a very thought-provoking and, I think, timely work. We are 20 years from the end of the Soviet Union and from the end of the Cold War. The world is a very different place. And I can think of no two people I would rather have think about what has happened over the last 20 years, where it has taken us, and what we start from for the next 20 years than Andrew Wood and Lilia Shevtsova. Andrew is a longtime friend and was a great colleague while I was in Moscow at the end of the 90s, and Andrew shared our trials and tribulations as the ambassador from Her Majesty's government. Lilia Shevtsova doesn't really need an introduction to this audience. She is one of our greatest minds at Carnegie and a very thoughtful person about her own country, its society, and its development over the last couple of 3 decades. So I'm not going to say much more. I have been instructed that we will begin today by hearing from Sir Andrew. And we will then turn to Lilia to continue the conversation, which I think sort of will pick up from where the book begins, middle, and ends. So, Andrew, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Jim. As I, in fact, remarked somewhere in the book, one of the unnerving things about being with Americans is they're so polite. But what Jim said about our cooperation in Moscow was certainly very heartfelt from my point of view. To have his solid breadth of experience, even if we didn't always agree, was a great reassurance and remains so to this day, because I know that he remains extraordinarily active in this field. I'd also just like to say thank you to Lilia, who challenged me to do this, though in a slightly different format. She wanted originally to write a book together, but fortunately or unfortunately, we found that we differed slightly in various ways, so that we thought it was better to do it in the way we have. I mean, the book is intended to provoke discussion. It cannot and does not aspire to lay down what exactly has happened or is going to happen, because I'm sure nearly everybody in this room will have different views on that. It was also for me a first, because I've never written very much for public consumption. I've written some things for Chatham House, but this is the first major thing I've ever done. Most of my career, I've been very lucky not to have been WikiLeaked. So I think the things that were laid in my mind very much when we began the project was the difference in views between thoughtful Russians and people in the West, with the Russians on the whole being very much more concerned and alarmed about the possibilities of where their country was going and is going than people in the West. We tend to regard that as just being typically Russian and slightly over-emotional, but I think it actually goes deeper than that. And there are also quite a lot of range of differences in the West, I would say particularly perhaps between the United States and Europe, and I'll come back to that if I may a little bit later. But Lilia and I did agree on one big thing, that over the Putin years, the tightening of central control has seriously limited the room for hopeful political and, as a result, economic evolution. It has increased the abuse of power by the structures of the state, thereby at the same time eroding the cohesion of those structures, and it's widened the gap between the rulers and the ruled. This is something which, in both our views, ought to concern us as non-Russians as well. And that explains the title of our book, which we didn't put any punctuation in it, but you can read it as a command, change or decay, or do we face change or decay, however you like. But those are the two options, it seemed to us, that lay on the table. So, Lydia.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, if I may, I would like to join Andrew in thanking, because every book, even if it's written by one or two people, it's a collective product. And of course, we are thankful to Jessica for her unwavering support. Sometimes I'm thinking, when she's going to be bored by our products. Well, we are thankful to the Carnegie team, and I would like, on our behalf, mention first of all Ilonka, Oswald, Jocelyn Solly, Zina Friedman, Dan Kennelly, our editor. Well, it's, if they did our book, they can do any mystery book now. And a couple words about our message and about our maybe very traumatic experience. It seems to me that we've started the book thanks to Andrew, and we've finished the book thanks to Andrew, because it's his sense of irony. I'm not sure whether it's British sense of irony or not. And your graciousness very often balanced my, extremist, absolutely terrific straightforwardness, which could have spoiled the whole project. And with respect to the message, well, we've been fighting with analyzing failure. Failure, civilizational, intellectual, political failure, and we've been thinking and we've been deliberating on the price of this failure. We are talking about failure of Russia to transform, just what you've mentioned, and failure of the Russian and Western political, intellectual, and business community very often to understand the trends and to foresee, failure to foresee that we are paying now. And there is one message, apparently, that we would like to convey. Russia has started its way not towards stagnation or decay. Stagnation and decay, these are the Kremlin words now. These words are quite popular within the Valdai Club of the Russian analysts. Everybody acknowledges that Russia is in decay. But the problem runs much deeper. Russia is in the process of using a very good phrase, pithy phrase coined by Arnold Toynbee, in the process of suicidal statecraft. And here I would like to mention that quite a few factors that we've been discussed, and we've discussed them as factors that help to preserve stability and prolong and reproduce stability, have started firstly to undermine the state, to undermine the system, and to undermine the regime. And among those factors, I would mention the elections that are forthcoming, elections without choice, the imitation of institutions, the commodity economy, the fact that there is no alternative, the fact that homebred nationalism is becoming anti-Putin nationalism. All these factors have started to undermine the status quo. Or to put it crudely, the Russia strain has left the status quo stop.
I said just now that I wanted to come back to foreign policy issues. Can I make just 2 points first, which ought in principle to be obvious, but are quite easily forgotten? First, it is that domestic policy and domestic issues are what determine foreign policy. If you doubt that, you can consider what's going on in the Eurozone and the rest of the EU now. It is perfectly clear that what Germany's attitude towards the euro, Greece's attitude towards the euro, and so on and so forth, is determined in the first place by domestic assumptions and domestic hopes and domestic pressures. Then you must consider that Russia is dominated by a small and hermetic clique Putin's determining aim is, and institutionally must be, to preserve his system of rule. There's a clear pattern to its construction and operation since 2000, and part of that is the claim that Russia has the right to be a great power. And this is my second point, because that goes to a critical assumption that Russia's proper analogue is with the United States, a theme, incidentally, which runs through Dmitry Trenin's recent and very interesting book, Post-Imperium, which is also published by Carnegie, as everybody knows, I'm sure. The reset, it seems to me, has enjoyed useful success. But the central pillar of the START renewal played to these Russian delusions. Russia is not a great power in any meaningful sense of the word, nor do I personally know what a great power actually is, except that it doesn't necessarily feed its people. The present discussion of ABM issues seems to many of us in Europe particularly bizarre. Even mad, that is of course an acronym in this case. But it is somehow reassuring to the political establishment in Moscow to suppose that the West has designs on them. That is actually genuinely crazy. European views are more varied, but arms control for Europe is not really an issue at all. It's more Russian aspirations towards control of its neighboring space that is the predominant concern. You wouldn't hear many, or possibly any, I don't know, European leaders referring sympathetically to the idea, as I have heard some Americans do, that Russia deserves a defensive glacis. Who is going to attack her from the West? But inherited stereotypes, and in this case they come from a long background, but they are inherited stereotypes, and they are stereotypes, have lingering power.
Well, you see that we simply made a list of several points, and Andrew is dealing with the most important and crucial points. I will raise another point from another area, which it seems to me is important. It was important when we made this long annual discussion, and it seems to me that the current context that we have and the recent developments, both in Russia and outside of Russia, prove that this is really a very important development to watch. I'm talking about the emergence of new mythology, new myths, new illusions with respect to Russia, somehow erased and pursued by people from both sides, Russians and foreigners and Western as well. The Valdai Club is the latest example of how people could pursue new illusions, or the old ones. And one of the myths, apparently, is the fact that so many people suddenly, after September 24, when Putin decided to return to the Kremlin, they suddenly started to persuade ourselves and themselves that Putin will definitely do the reform, that he is doomed to have the reform. And the question is, why he never, cared to do the reform, the real reform, during the previous 20 years? They say, okay, he will do the reform, as he said, evolutionary way, step by step, gradually. But, if one looks at the history of reforms and transformation, it's very difficult to find any example of gradual pursuing the rule of law, for instance. How it can be done? Maybe in gated communities. And I found, by the way, one example when the rule of law and competition were introduced gradually, in these closed areas before Skolkovo. It was the experience of China in the 19th century. They introduced the rule of law, competition, and the private property for foreigners within the gated communities. I don't want to tell you how it ended for foreigners, especially within the gated communities, during one of the most powerful Chinese peasant revolutions. Well, so for me, gradual pursuing and implementation of rule of law means like, to be half pregnant. Quite an unusual experience. But still, a lot of people do believe it. And it seems to me that we are dealing with new myth or misperception or intentional illusion that has to justify somehow, the continuation of the same rule and justify the same foreign policy attitude towards Russia on the part of some international actors.
I can't resist in commenting that although Hong Kong was not a gated community in quite this sense, it was rather successful, but then that was our law. But my last point that I want to make leads on from what Lilia has just said. I wasn't actually at the recent Valdai Club meeting, but from the press reports of what Putin said there, it was perfectly clear that he has no intention of changing course and becoming a, quote, reformer, unquote, or anything that we would honestly recognize as such. I think the Financial Times Generate had its headline something like, Putin returns with his usual swagger, or something like that. That's not, of course, to say that there won't be modest adjustments to the economic and, no, I wouldn't say the political, but to the economic system. But I don't think he can do anything more than that. If you just try a small thought experiment, you can see why. Real structural change, as all the analyses produced by quite a large number of Russians about what is desirable to meet the problems they have coming down the road, they all involve a system of real accountability, of transparency, and independent adjudication. Well, why would Putin and those around him run the risk of introducing any such thing? The risk would surely be all the greater if, as I believe is the case, significant sections of Russian society were already becoming rather disgruntled with the present system. I think that is his real dilemma. His real dilemma is that coming down the track, he maybe even know, but certainly most I would call the active Russians in the capital cities, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, and one or two places like that, are very conscious of the need for change and adjustment, very conscious of the need for more devolution of responsibility. The ordinary Russian goes to the court at Strasbourg for the very good reason that they can't get justices home. I'm not sure it's a good thing, but the British have made a bit of an industry over having oligarchs fight each other, and I've read with great interest the conflict between Abramovich and Berezovsky. But they have to go outside in order to get justice to be done, so they too have a gripe, and I believe it is one that increases rather than decreases. They have a problem with the disintegration of the forces of law and order, if I use that phrase, which have become, instead of protectors, they've become predators. These are real ills in Russian society, which the present elite will find extraordinarily difficult, without great danger to themselves, to address. So I think it's reasonable to look 2, 3, 4, maybe more years ahead, but to look for 2 presidential terms of 6 years each, I think is a long way before there's going to be real problems for the present hierarchy. Lilia.
Well, I have only to add a couple of sentences to what Andrew has just said. Well, I'm thinking aloud. Still, I haven't decided about the key trajectory of Russia for myself. It seems to me that we are doomed to have 2 scenarios that in fact resemble very much modifications, well, look like modification of the same scenario. One scenario, continuation of the current rot and stagnation, and the second scenario, implosion, with all these very unpleasant and dramatic consequences. But both scenarios, in fact, lead to one outcome, to disintegration of the nuclear petrostate, which has started already. And when Andrew has used the word disintegration, you used already the word. Well, I can simply push the ball a bit further and remind us that disintegration of the Russian Federation has started already, and Russia has lost control over part of its territory in the Northern Caucasus. And the Russian system and the regime have lost control of one of the most important, the spine element of the system, the presidential vehicle, that cannot cope with the corruption. And unfortunately, and this is very unfortunate, that what is happening with us, this very traumatic experience again, unfinished business with Russia, it happens in the atmosphere of the general decay. Fukuyama is writing about America's dysfunction. Walter Laqueur wrote a book about European decay. When I haven't read Neil Ferguson's book yet. I've read only a review, but it seems to me he's writing about stench of decay in the West as general. Well, in any case, the moods for me in the West resemble very much, I don't remember these years, but I read about them, the 70s, and the famous Carter malaise. So without the West overcoming its own malaise, it's futile for us Russians to think about our own revival. And I remember how in the 70s the West has found the exit solution. Helsinki, we just found another Helsinki II process last week. So Helsinki became the end of the post-war epoch through the new balancing of normative values and interests. And a lot depends on the exit solution from this malaise now. In any case, Russia, of course, is a challenge for herself. And to a great degree, Russia is a challenge for the Western community. I'm done.
All right, that's a preview of the book for you and the discussion and the conversation. And what I'd like to do is see whether we can continue that conversation in a rather more multilateral format with the audience. So I would welcome questions or comments from the audience or your observations on what you've heard. And I guess I would take questions. If you would wait for a microphone and identify yourself when you get your question. Ann Edberger up here.
Ed Berger, the Eurasian Medical Education Program. There was a great deal of hand-wringing in the early 90s in the West, and particularly in the United States, about what our posture should be towards the new Russia, the evolving Russia. Two unfair questions to you, if I could. One is, what could we have done, if anything, that would have made that history different? And what should we think about our posture at the present time with the same idea in mind?
Well, this is one of the points we had some disagreement about, so Lily would like to comment probably on what I have to say. I think I was probably in saying that I didn't think there was all that much more we could have done in the early 90s by the realization there's probably not a lot more that we would have done in the early 90s. That for two reasons. One is that it's really extraordinarily difficult to grasp the full meaning of a new situation totally and at once. And also because one must doubt if the obvious thing we could have done, which was to give a lot of money and to provide that sort of support, would have been effective. I had the fortune or misfortune to serve twice in Yugoslavia, along the last time with Ambassador Presler, who's here today. I was quite impressed by the futility of outside help there. But a lot of Russians do feel that had we given more help at the beginning, that would have done a lot psychologically to demonstrate that the West was a true friend, had their interests at heart, and so on and so forth. I just don't know. I mean, but Lilia was there in a way that I was not. So,
well, if I may, just to add a couple of points. I would say, just look at reset. Reset between the United States and Russia demonstrate that between tactical interests and strategic interests, there is a kind of tension and disparity. Reset has been pretty successful from the tactical point of view for both countries, and at the same time as strategic disaster, due to the fact that the reset as a foreign policy was delinked from what is happening in Russia. So I do believe that the West, in the 90s at least, didn't think much how to balance interests and values, tactical agenda and strategic perspectives. And at the same time, if you convince me that nothing could have been done, this will bring me to another conclusion, to conclusion that the interests of the West, at least tactically, do not coincide with the interests of liberal Russia, and I will accept it.
Can I just say, you asked two questions, actually. What can we do now? I think it's a good way of thinking of it is to break it down into small issues. To look for issues where we can and do and should cooperate. Not to consider Russia as simply an expression of the ruling group, which is after all a small group, but to remember that Russia consists of a large number of interests and it's a complex society, which the way we act and what we can do is interpreted variously among those people. It will be a different society in the future, so the way we act now will have different effects in the future. Grand policy is often rather diversionary because it tends to focus on one or two issues. And I personally think that a policy of small steps, looking for where you can work together, being robust where you cannot, and avoiding a grand narrative is actually a pretty good way to proceed.
I'm afraid that I have to add also one specific thing. There was perhaps the only window of opportunity for Russia during several months in 1991 in the fall, between September and apparently the end of November, where Yeltsin, who had absolutely wonderful, tremendous support among the population, 68%, and at the same time he believed in the West and wanted to be part of the West. It was kind of, even unconscious desire to be part of the European and Western community. And he listened to any advice coming from the West. If the Western political establishment, the leaders, persuaded Yeltsin that he needed to discard the old leftovers of the Soviet state, the Congress of People's Deputies, etc., and endorse the new constitution based on rule of law and division of powers, maybe Russian destiny could have been a different one. But the window of opportunity was very narrow, and it closed in December of the same year.
And of course, neither Jim nor I were there, so.
I was.
Oh, you,
I'm afraid I'm to blame.
well, you weren't ambassador anyway.
No, I was not there. Yes, in the back, I can't see. Yes, yeah.
My name is
Fritz.
Fritz Ehrmart. I'm a longtime listener to these discussions, occasional contributor. For Lilia, you actually answered my question en passant in your last remark before the opening to Q&A, but I got to ask it anyway just to make real sure you mean what you said and we hear what you said. You said that unless the West recovers from its malaise, there's not much point in Russians like you struggling for Russia to recover from its malaise. Now, the West is undergoing a crisis of capitalism, obviously, but it's also a crisis of democracy in that over the years, democracy has been less and less, while truly democratic in the Western countries, it's been less and less able to deliver effective, responsible, accountable, but especially effective self-government, the consequences of which we see in the fiscal debt crisis that has become a crisis of modern capitalism. Now, my question was going to be, has this crisis in the West demoralized, undermined the confidence of, the elan of people in Russia who are struggling for responsible, accountable, transparent, law-governed, democratic, effective government like yourself? And you said, well, it has. But do you really mean that? Because our crisis is very profound, and it's not going to be overcome quickly, even if we struggle through the crash and burn scenarios of our economies. Might it not be, in an ironic way, the other way, that Russian progressives, Democrats, true liberals in the old-fashioned word, can stand before Russians and say, we must chart a course that does not emulate the West?
If I may, to answer your question, Fritz, in a very crude way, because, well, I don't have time to allow shades of meaning. I will start with the second part of your question. I don't see at the moment possibility for Russian liberals and Democrats to unite, to consolidate, and to stand before the society with any kind of alternative. Secondly, I don't believe that the Russian liberal opposition, even if it does emerge, can offer Russia a liberal alternative different from the Western rules of the game. I don't believe in that. And thirdly, yes, the Western civilization has lost for many Russians the attractiveness of the, I would say, of something that we have to strive for. But, you know, this losing attractiveness for the Russian society has started a long time ago, and it was the result maybe of the Western, I'm looking for soft word, Western acquiescence to the Russian system, to the Russian matrix, and to the developments happening in Russia.
I can't resist commenting that everything is relative. It doesn't seem to me that the collapse of Western society is quite as grave as you say. And people who say that capitalism is going wrong, I mean, I think they have to elaborate what alternative there is and exactly how and whether it can be fixed and so on like that. But as I made clear, I'm not very partial to grand schemes. So I find that a little bit difficult to accept. I think we've got a lot more. You only actually have to go to Russia to see what we got going for us.
Yes, in the middle and the back.
Steve Winters, local researcher. I understand the point about the elites being a small group, and and then you have the whole country in a complex situation. But let's look at someone who's definitely not in the political elite, Solzhenitsyn. Now, when he was in the U.S., he became rather unpopular with the elites in the U.S. for his comments, for instance, his address at the Harvard graduation, and so forth and so on. Now, from the standpoint of a Russian who was looking at Solzhenitsyn as an intellectual leader, a patriot, a thinker in the Russian tradition going back, well, into the 19th century at least, how would such a person with that orientation view the direction in which, say, Putin is going, as opposed to proposed European norms, liberal norms?
Then it's apparently, the question is for me.
I think so.
You know, I have very complicated attitude towards Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was the hero for Russia, for the Soviet Union, in times of resistance, in times of getting rid of the communist rule. And he has made tremendous contribution to this process, political and intellectual. Very unfortunately that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he failed to found a niche, a role, a place, and the doctrine and the concept that he cherished and offered Russia was a kind of, traditional return to the same traditional matrix, only without communism. Hardly the solution.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Temuri Yakubashvili, Georgian ambassador. I want to congratulate, first of all, to Carnegie Endowment for this wonderful book and to authors. And I want to tell to our Western friends, stop crying for the West. I mean,
Good.
it's a very good system, and you have a very good system that it will overcome all the crises. And stop discouraging those who live in the former Soviet Union. As now to the question, Mr. Putin said nothing about domestic changes or what he's going to do domestically, but he said something about foreign policy, and he published an article about new Eurasian State, which largely is focused on former Soviet Union borders, which obviously is issue of concern to those who live next to Russia and want to see democratic Russia. So if you can elaborate, both of you, about this new or old idea of Putin about new Eurasian State. Thank you.
I think your comment is both new and old hits a point. I'm not sure how many Russians would actually welcome it if there was free movement of people and everybody from Tajikistan could come to Russia and so on and so forth. I think they perhaps wouldn't like it that much. You're quite right to imply that most of the countries who are neighbors of Russia would not wish to be ruled by Moscow, as they would suppose that they would be in a situation like that, and that is its intention. We've heard this tune played so many times that, to me at least, it doesn't carry much conviction. I do not think it's something that the West should in any way support. I don't think it's anything that the West should oppose either, come to that. If countries wish to unite themselves with Russia in a common political endeavor, well, that's up to them. I doubt whether they would want that. But as I say, that's really their choice. And I think that is the difference between, or one of the differences between our political outlook and that of Moscow. There is no compulsion on any of the countries that are currently neither members of the Western organizations nor have formal ties to Russia to do anything except follow what they conceive to be their own interest to be. But as I say, we've heard it before. I don't know how many times I read about the union of Belarus and Russia and various elaborate schemes for that to come about. And when Russia is finding it extraordinarily difficult to maintain its internal cohesion, if one considers the Caucasus especially, then it just doesn't make much sense to think that those other countries, most of whom are also ruled by single, very small groups of people, and would not wish to cede their power to Putin. It seems to me fantasy, really. But of course, I want to think it is.
I will just only add one thing. It seems to me the whole concept of Vladimir Putin's idea of those, Eurasian alliances is a good response to those pundits, including in Washington. I've read several analysis just recently, yesterday, to those pundits in Washington who firstly are saying that Putin is not suspicious of the United States, I'm quoting. Secondly, Putin and Obama or any American president would continue the reset as usual. Well, that will be very interesting to watch really what Putin is saying now. For instance, on Tymoshenko, she is pro-Western, pro-European. That's why she is my opponent. Medvedev, again on Ukraine, you are either with us or against us. We'll never allow you to go further into Europe. So while I do believe that it's a very timely thing, this idea of Mr. Putin with the Eurasian alliance. It clears the picture. And we now know what to expect from Putin for.
Yes, in the middle, in the back.
Elspeth Others. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy. And my question actually is concerning nationalism. You've already sort of alluded to the rising influence of nationalism in Russia, and you mentioned how it is becoming now more closely associated with the opposition, or at least with reformist figures, for example, Navalny joining, Russian March and so on. And I was wondering if you could just say a few words about the direction that you see Russian nationalism moving in and what influence it's likely to have in future Russian politics.
Russian nationalism is at the moment compensation for lack of understanding or for inability to understand the reasons of social problems. So the social unhappiness transforms into national hatred. This is point number one. Point number two, Russian nationalism has no even an inch of, for instance, Ukrainian or Belarusian or New European, Polish New European nationalism, which is directed towards the West. Russian nationalism is directed towards the past. And thirdly, the Russian nationalism in many aspects is being controlled, triggered, and provoked by the Kremlin. But lately, the elite and the Kremlin team has lost control over it. And nationalism is more and more is acquiring anti-regime, anti-system, and anti-Putin flavor. But what will be the result of the genie out of the bottle? We can only get scary.
It is an alarming phenomenon, and anti-national violence against ethnic minorities is a serious problem in cities in Russia. It's also a problem in wider Europe. So I think it is more serious and more threatening in Russia, but I don't think that the rest of us in Europe can say that there is no ethnic feeling in Western Europe. That there are politicians in Western Europe as well who should look more closely at themselves in the mirror.
Yes, right here. Yep.
My name is Marina Kaljurand. I'm a Estonian ambassador to the United States, and I have the privilege of knowing Lilia from the years when I was Estonian ambassador to Russia. It's good to see you here. My question is to Lilia. You say that you don't see any possibility that the liberals and Democrats will unite and stand to see...
At the moment, I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
At the moment. But if you look at the longer perspective, backward and forward, what are the positive signs, if any, appearing today among the liberals and Democrats? And is there anything positive you can say about the opposition movement today in Russia?
It's so great to see Marina. Marina is one of the heroes of Russian, I would say, a liberal minority and pro-Western community, because Marina was you were standing nearly in the tank or inside of the car when those Nazi movement were attacking you on Moscow streets. Well, and there are a few embassies, including British, by the way. I'm not sure that American ambassador came to save you, but definitely he came.
It was Bill Burns.
So it was Bill. I don't know. So I saw the Swedish ambassador and the British ambassador. Okay, well, good. I'm trying now to be totally cruel. I don't see any signs at the moment for the Russian liberals and Democrats to consolidate without firstly making a kind of, farewell to the past and to the old squabbles and to the 90s. Secondly, dissociating themselves from the Russian liberals, systemic liberals in the government. Thirdly, without social tide coming to the fore. It is the Tamil, it is the street, it is the pressure from outside that make leaders, that make unity possible, that make parties and movements. In the situation of total graveyard, it's very difficult to consolidate anyone. And apparently what we are expecting, the new tide of faces. The new faces will be coming to the fore, and they will have probably one very important obstacle. Firstly, they have to rethink their skeptical attitude towards the West, especially after Obama reset. Secondly, they have to get rid of their hopes that nationalism could be constructive. And this is still ahead of us. But probably we have to hit the bottom, to drink the bitter cup of tea first. So to see the turmoil, to see people on the street, to see harassment of liberals, to see disappointment, frustration, before they will come to conclusion that perhaps this is the exit solution. And with respect to the society, there are much more people who will be looking forward in this direction, but after the crisis. Crisis is the game changer. And you know, sometimes the Russian crisis could be pretty unsavory and pretty nasty.
I would prefer to be slightly more optimistic than that. For the similar reasons, I think, as you were saying, that the West tends to run itself down. It does seem to me that there are changes within the broader Russian thinking about where the country is going that point to, if you like, a liberalization of political ideas, and that the pressures of coming down the track are such that I should think that process will continue. But the real difficulty is there are no channels for these things to be expressed. I'm not a Russian, and I'm not a Russian politician, but I'm continually struck, it is true, by the ability of Russians of, broadly speaking, liberal persuasion to quarrel with each other. And that is a disadvantage, but it can also be quite revivifying. I'm also struck by the number of Russians who act with inspiring bravery. And that very much continues to be the case in the name of justice, in the name of decency. And it seems to me that is basically a liberal impulse as well. So I wouldn't be quite as upset about that, as discouraged about that. But the real difficulty is the fact that institutional channels, which ought to give the political opportunities for these sorts of ambitions and hopes to be realized and discussed and fructified through discussion within society, have all been destroyed. The destruction of the Duma, which is what it amounts to, matters. The destruction of the courts matters. The destruction of regional politics matters. Those things are serious obstacles to what I think would otherwise be a more encouraging prospect of organic and decent change. So I don't disagree with what Lilia says about what is likely to happen. I suppose I would just like to disagree a bit more than I actually do.
Yes, in the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi. I am with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. I think it was 1975 or 76 at the University of California, Riverside, Professor Schwartz's class. There's a Russian who came and spoke to us on the World Politics class. He did a very good job describing what's going on in the Soviet Union, etc. And then I asked him a question, and the question I said to him, listen, of all the things that you've said, none of them will destroy the Soviet Union. I said, what will destroy the Soviet Union is if they cannot meet the needs of its people. Gentleman questioned here earlier about the liberals and America view. What I think Putin will do, he's lining for the economic collapse, the slow collapse of the United States and Europe to figure out what to be done in Russia.
Could you comment?
You're certainly right that Putin and everybody else has got plenty to learn from how we cope or don't cope with our problems, as we have plenty to learn from the way they don't cope with theirs. I think it would be unfair to suppose that President Putin or anyone else wishes his country to collapse or wishes his country to be anything other than prosperous. The problem there is having closed the means of getting there. It's the narrowing of the vertical, the criminalization of the structures of law enforcement and so on and so forth, the real threat, not what people hope for. That would be my comment.
Yes, sir. Here, right here.
Judd Harriet, documentary filmmaker. You have painted a fairly grim picture of governance in Russia. Predatory elites, no rule of law, this sort of thing. We haven't talked about the economic effects of this. I'm not sure this is in your brief or not, but I'll ask the question anyway. What has been the effect on economic growth and development in Russia? And better yet, has there emerged a business class in Russia? And if there has, what have they brought to the table in terms of pressing for liberal reform?
Maybe I will start, and then Andrew, of course, will give you a substantiated answer because, well, he's dealing with business.
Yeah, I betrayed straight away there.
Yes. Well, Russia looks much better than Greece, and even better than Italy, which gives a lot of optimism, apparently, to the Kremlin elite. 4% of annual growth. Pretty good, isn't it? But apparently they seriously understand the problem because even they, Medvedev and Putin, are telling about the need to modernize, to diversify the commodity economy, and they see the limits. But at the same time, they have this absolutely fantastic idea that they can recharge the economy, they can re-energize the economy by, by luring investments, both Russian and Western investments, without changing the investment climate, without changing the state control over property. So they've got this kind of crazy idea that people again will come, will invest without any kind of guarantee. And the fact that the economic potential becomes narrow and narrow, but still there is some potential. But the fact is, if the oil price declines to $60 per barrel, Russia faces total collapse. And I will give you just anecdotal story. I cannot give you the name of the guy because, well, he belongs to the government. He's a member of the government. We were sitting 2 months ago at the High School of Economics, where usually the government economists are producing and sharing their deep thoughts about economic development. And we were on the same panel with him. Of course, I made my share hitting the government and talking about collapse, etc., in the longer perspective. And he then whispers into my ear, you know what? You're an optimist. Because, well, it can drag only for 2 more years, and then that's the end. I looked at him astounded. He's the guy who is producing, the economic strategy, who is responsible, for our economic life, one of them. And he doesn't believe that Russia will prolong this El Dorado of 4% during the next 2 years. But I will give you in the hands of the specialist. Andrew, this is your piece of meat.
Well, it's a very big question. So, of course, there are some sectors of the Russian economy which are doing well and producing new things. But most of the Russian economy consists of very large enterprises inherited from the Soviet past. They're both too big to fail and too big to work. The scale of obsolescence is huge. As Lilia said, the price of oil is the determining factor right now. You may have a better idea than I do what the price of oil is going to be in 3 or 4 years' time. But the way the West is going at present, it's not likely to be all that high. On the other hand, who knows when Iraq will come on production, so it may be prolonged, but that is the key to it. And the other key is that They've talked recently, for example, about more privatization. That actually means privatization to which friend of the regime? It isn't true privatization and making companies independent of the governing structures. It's part of the same mix. When Deripaska said that he would surrender Basel to the state once if it was demanded of him, he was only recognizing what is true. He would have no choice. It's an economy which is founded on, above all, who you know and who you pay your dues to. It's indicative that, for example, one of the things that's most needed is a renewal of the railway system, the road system, and so on, that sort of basic infrastructure like that. Huge amounts of money have been chucked at it in the past with almost no result. They have particular problems of climate and so on and so forth, but their rate of making effective investment is extraordinarily low. So, in that sense, they're living on borrowed time. But I wouldn't really. What I really want to get across is that it could do so much better, and that people in Russia know that it could do so much better. It's reached a sort of middle level of income where there has to be disaggregation of major enterprises before it can really resume. There has to be a great influx of foreign investment, foreign ownership too, which maybe under WTO will gradually come, I don't know. But the strains of change are going to be very considerable. So it's very natural that while it looks reasonable, the ruling cabal will certainly want to continue as they are. They're not going to give up Gazprom, they're not going to change Gazprom, which is, forgive me if any of you got shares here, I think one of the most ghastly companies that was ever created in terms of corruption and in terms of opaqueness of its dealings and so on and so forth. But it's greatly advantageous to those who are in it, and it's greatly advantageous to the government. So it's not going to stop being that for any time soon.
Jessica?
It seems to me, sorry, Jessica Matthews at Carnegie, that the same issue connects the debate we had about whether the West could have done more or would have resulted in a different outcome if it had done more in the early 90s, on the one hand, and the question about whether there is, in fact, a link that, as Lilia posited, between whether Russia could modernize, liberalize in this period of Western economic and woes and political polarization. I must say, I think decay is the wrong word I'm with. But I think the issue that connects those two debates is whether you believe that fundamental political change ever comes, ever in history, from outside forces. I don't believe it does. And so for me, what is most both interesting and puzzling about Russia over the last 15 years has been the lack of demand among ordinary Russian people for political change. You know, how quickly Russians accepted the loss of brand new freedoms in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I wondered whether you two could talk for a while about what you see as not business elites, not government, but or how do Russians think about their political situation? I mean, is there any valid demand for a different system? That seems to me to be the, and from outside and as a non-expert, I don't see it.
Okay, Thank you, Jessica. If I may start, and Andrew will add because he has ideas on that issue. Firstly, the change is not coming from outside. I agree if we are talking about the very primitive notion of the regime change and when we are thinking about Iraq, etc. But in fact, the collapse of the Soviet Union, to a great degree, maybe to a crucial degree, was the result of the fact that the Soviet Union lost in its competition with Reagan and with the West. So it was pressure of the Western society, mostly of America, and those strategic wars,
Star Wars.
the Star Wars, that were the last nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. Secondly, for the first time in the Russian history, and it never happened before, and it never happened to such degree in all other more or less known civilizations, when the major bulk of the Russian establishment, business establishment, political, intellectual establishment, has been personally integrated into the Western society on the personal level. I'm not explaining how it's been done, but personal integration has reached abysmal size. Well, in fact, the whole of the Russian elite earns and lives by shifts coming to Russia on, during the week and live in Russia on Friday, for London, for Paris, etc., etc. And the fact that the Russian elite has been personally integrated together with Putin and his family, personally integrated into the Western society, creates a lot of incentives and possibilities for the West to influence the Russian domestic development, which has never happened before. We never had this kind of phenomena. This is secondly. And thirdly, the fact that Russia is behaving in such a way inside of the country, following the rules of the game within the Western civilization and Western society, with acquiescence of the Western elite, and personal cooptation of part of the Western elite and business elite, starting with Schroeder. We are talking about Schroeder because it's the name of the phenomenon. Allows the Russian elite to feel so safe and to behave in this way inside of the country. This factor never worked before, it works now. And we never been politically correct here and there. We never raised the question about the Russia's impact over the Western society, intellectual, political, etc. Impact in France, and such newspapers, for instance, Nouvel Observateur, and we are quoting him. Yes, we are quoting him. He has made an investigation how the Russians are influencing the French political life tremendously. Well, this is about no changes coming from outside. Secondly, the second part of the question, how Russians are viewing the rules of the game, whether they really want something. What I can say, for the first time again in the Russian history, there are no insurmountable barriers that prevent Russians from getting out from the Russian paradigm. They are not coming to the streets like Arabs did, or like Ukrainians did in 2004, or like constantly Georgians are doing. But they have this kind of resistance with respect to the liberal rules of the game. And 60% of Russians now consider that rules of the game are more important than the leaders. And only 40% of Russians believe that the leaders are more important and the leader will save Russia. So there is a qualitative change in the mentality. The problem is how to move from this mechanical acceptance by the major part of the society of rules of the game towards fight and struggle to implement these rules of the game. And here, very nasty, very unfortunate, a very pessimistic moment is coming. It seems to me 5, 6, 7 years ago, Russians were much more ready to accept the new rules of the game, starting with rule of law, etc., than now, because the degree of demoralization and atomization under the current system has been tremendous. And I cannot totally exclude that we lose in some perspective even those people, that have been supporting the principles, the values. Under this kind of system, the more it stays, the worse it becomes. And some regions of Russia are lost beyond already repair. They are lost. That's a totally different universe. We have to do, just to surround them with gated, with fences. Andrew, you have to disagree with me.
Well, I do and I don't. These sorts of changes are enormously subtle and particularly for a foreigner, enormously difficult to interpret correctly. It is certainly true that major economic reform would be extremely disruptive for a considerable part of the population. When you consider how many firms in Russia are in practice bankrupt, and as I said earlier, how many of them are really too big to succeed anyway, the logical answer from that, from if you're writing an economic paper, is that they must be allowed to go bankrupt, they must break up and so on and so forth. But you've got the huge problems of monotowns and so on and so forth. That's very difficult for people to understand. It is certainly true that there is enormous malaise in Russia, particularly at the more senior levels of society, who found their children have left the country. That is a source of great hurt, even for people who are, within the terms of their society, hugely rich and hugely successful. When they say, my children are not going to come back from school in England, which is, of course, a fine country, but not actually paradise, that is a realization which is wounding and dispiriting. I don't see how it will change or how it's going to change. I would, however, note that the ruling elite are peculiarly nervous about the possibilities of popular unrest. They naturally attribute it, and in a way it's a compliment, since it's something we couldn't actually arrange even if we wanted to the wicked West and for stirring up orange revolutions and so on and so forth. But they genuinely fear it. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, it just is an indication of uncertainty at the top as well. So it seems to me that there are significant changes going on within Russian society. Russian aspirations and hopes are no different on a popular level from those that there are in any other country. They want justice, they want to be able to work, to have their possessions protected. They want not to have their houses taken away by corrupt officials and so on and so forth. And that I do have a remaining faith that somehow that will act as a force for the future good of that society, as it has done for others. There are plenty of reasons you could dispute that. I would just add one last factor. When Lilia was saying about the Star Wars and so on, bringing down the Soviet Union, I'm not sure I absolutely agree with that. But one of the things that did bring it down was sheer bloody boredom. I mean, just seeing Brezhnev up there and the stupid jokes all the time is a really powerful factor. They're quite bored with Putin already. I promised, if this book is ever published in Russian, to take off my shirt and have a fine photograph of myself. Like that. But these sorts of things do actually have an effect, I think. Nobody has greeted the return of Putin with euphoria or hope or supposition that it represents a renewal. You may or may not have voted for Obama in this room, but no one could possibly deny that his election was a moment of renewal for the United States. It was a moment of hope. If you contrast that with the announcement done through the lips of an humiliated President Medvedev, that Putin would return, that is a huge political failure. It's a huge social failure. It deprives Russia of an opportunity which would otherwise have of renewal. I don't believe that Putin will be there for 12 years.
No.
Theoretically, he could be there for 12 and then bring in Medvedev again for another 6 and then 12 more after that. So he would leave feet first. One way or another, he's going to leave. So Russia will change. And I don't see why, in principle, there won't be good forces in Russia or good wishes or good hopes in Russia that will find some way of expressing themselves. I can't say what they are, because at the moment it's very difficult to see. It's more easy to see some pretty alarming risks. But these are good people, and this is a good country, and I think one shouldn't despair.
I will give you only several numbers. I just found them. Only 23% of Russians believe that Putin will solve the Russian problems. Only 31% of Russians approve his return. 25% of Russians believe that there will be mass protests, and 21% are ready to take part in those massive protests. But when we are talking about 25%, it's 25 million people. Sorry? Oh, okay. So something is stirring, something is just, bubbling beneath the surface. The problem is what will be the price of it to explode and how we can deal with that. And the major issue for the Russian elite, and everybody's talking about, Russians are talking about among themselves, whether it will come before we find some recipe and alternative, or will be driven by the tide. This is the most, popular question.
I'm going to use a prerogative here
Sorry.
to say a word or two in the form of a question. Perhaps will have to be our last. I used to say that the Soviet Union was canceled for lack of interest, because in some sense, as you said, it was boredom. It was also just the fact that no one was there to stand up for it anymore. And the question, in a sense, is, are we coming to anything like that condition? And there are one or two things I would just ask you to comment on. I mean, one of them is that people with our color hair, Lily, I apologize, but are in fact, no longer going to be the ones determining what happens in Russia anymore. And so many of the people that we read about in the Western press, or that people talk about as the liberals and so on, are all our age. These are people who are past it, frankly, in terms of determining the future. And this next generation of Russian, I won't say young people, but the coming generation, is a group of people who basically travel. They are mobile. I think somebody told me there were 36 million trips abroad last year by Russians.
Nearly the same people.
Well, it's 36 million trips, even so, is a lot. I mean, so the country is not closed anymore. There are comparisons being made, presumably. People are wondering about, what's next, and so on. And I understand, that there is this sort of westernized group that is, in some sense, living in its own society. It was different. But there's a second phenomenon going on. I mean, we've watched over the last few years a number of cases in which the government seems to have overstepped, and it brought a reaction. Whether it was the effort to tax the import of automobiles in the Far East, or the drivers, or the highway through the forest, there is somewhere a limit on government. And I suspect it's not just the big ones, it's also at the local level. But two things strike me about it. One is nobody seems able to become a spokesman for this. I mean, where are the new liberal leaders, in a sense, of the people who essentially do say something needs to get fixed? And, you know, what is the impact of the fact that people go back and forth all the time, the internet's open? I mean, there is a large group of people, and it's, as you said, there are a lot of people who aren't satisfied, even though they aren't ready to rebel. You know, where is this group's leadership? Because, I mean, we all are familiar with the people who are our age, who represented the change from the Soviet Union, who defined in many ways the direction. But quite frankly, I don't think they're very much connected to their country anymore. Because the population is younger, these are people who belong to another generation. And so I'm just curious whether you have any sense for us about who's coming along to carry if you will, the democratic mantle. Let's forget liberal, but just of a more democratic system.
I will begin, and then Lilia will wind up as being more authoritative on this sort of thing. In a way, I fully understand your observations and share them, but also in a way it's actually an unfair question, because there is no way that such people have a means of arising. It's not just that they would be in trouble if they did, although some people do poke their heads above the parapet, like Navalny has been popular for a bit, and Vladimir Milov, and people like that who are younger people. They do appear, but there's no machinery for them to exercise leadership through. So in that sense, your question is or your observation has a degree of unfairness to it. It's also the reason why, in the end, when you're looking for radical change, you're liable to be driven back to a picture of unplanned and unexpected and unfocused change, which has considerable dangers for us all. And I think that's why it's the principal focus of our book. But things do change in unexpected ways. You referred to particular pressures. One of the, I think, growing pressures at present is the pressure for the regions to be more effectively represented, and their political aspirations, in a very broadest sense, more effectively organized than they can be through a system of appointment. It was, I think, indicative that the present regime has felt it necessary to do everything it possibly can to emulate, to draw down the election of mayors. But I just don't know whether they're going to be able to continue that. Certainly regional pressures, regional aspirations are an important element of this. I think given the circumstances, the lack of ways in which people can articulate ambitions and attract a following, it's not surprising that it looks bleaker than I in fact think that it probably is. I hope. What I just don't see is the present regime being able to accept that sort of change, so that the situation will continue amorphous, unsatisfying, with protests about various things from in various places from time to time. This will have some political effect. There's just no way to focus it. And I think that is the real problem.
I agree. I agree. Jim, thank you for playing devil's advocate role. There are two things I would like to add. The previous regime, the Soviet regime, survived through closing the boundaries. This regime survives by opening the boundaries, allowing and even pushing the most dynamic intellectual people just go out, because we don't need you. We need demoralized society. Secondly, the previous regime, Soviet regime, survived by using repressions. This regime has still money and funds for cooptation. It's very difficult to find anyone who is not co-opted to this or that degree. But the resources and potential, financial included, of the regime well, the resources have started to dwindle. And under Medvedev, we see the increased role of the repressive legislature, where I have to admit, regretfully, my generation is fading. We are slowly bowing out of the political scene. And maybe the last legacy that we are leaving, well, I don't know whether David Kramer is here or not. Last week, we tried to open the new Helsinki process in Helsinki, in the same building where the Helsinki Charter in 1975 was signed. And we've started it with European liberals and Democrats trying to engage the Russian civil society. And there were a lot of young people from the civil society there, trying to make a kind of instrument, firstly, of re-energizing the Russian society, secondly, of re-energizing the West. That's what we may leave our younger generation. But I would agree with Andrew, and I will repeat what I've said responding to Marina. They're absolutely wonderful young people, especially in the regions. And I know that Jim, pays special attention to the regions. Well, there are a lot of young people, but not within the political parties. Politics and parties and political roof has become so discredited, but on the level of the civil society. Well, a vast majority of human resources. And I don't know what happens, when happens, and how it happened. Because even I don't remember how it happened in 1981. It just happened. It happens when people take to the street. It happens. And not liberals, regretfully, will be heading the social protest, but apparently majority left-wingers and nationalists. And that's our problem. We lost opportunity to persuade the younger generation to be liberals.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you very much, and I thank the audience, too, for being participants. The book by Lilia and Andrew is available in the back of the room. I encourage you to get it. It is a very worthwhile, thought-provoking, and excellent book to read and to think about. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much. Well done, guys.